You may proceed.
Thank you. Ms. Freeman, did you see any changes in Michael Ricci after the affair was disclosed?
Yes.
Could you describe what changes you saw in him?
He became a bit more talkative. He was sad, anxious, and stressed.
And what, if any, changes did you see in the defendant in terms of her kind of getting out and about?
She would still go out and do things, but it lessened over the years.
Could you describe further what you are talking about in terms of the time frame?
She would go out and do things in 2019, but then in 2020, when COVID hit, she stayed in the house a lot.
In all fairness, didn't most people?
Yes.
So was there anything unusually different about the way she was acting compared to other people in the house?
She eventually stayed in her room most of the time.
And was that leading up to the time that you left?
Yes.
And what, if any, changes did you see in Michael Ricci's drinking habits?
He stopped.
Do you recall when it was that he stopped in relationship to when you were told about the affair?
A couple months after.
Are you aware of any groups he began attending relating to his drinking?
Yes.
And what group was that?
AA.
And what, if any, observations did you make about how often he would go?
Multiple times a week.
And who, if anybody, would go with him to the AA meetings?
Christine.
As far as you observed, did she go to each meeting, to every meeting?
Objection. Based on
Sustained.
the foundation.
And what, if any, observations did you make relative to Michael Ricci's socializing?
He made a lot of friends in AA.
Were you familiar with his friends that were not AA related?
One of them.
Who was that?
Mark McDonald.
What, if any, changes did you see in the way or the amount of times that Michael Ricci hung out with friends like Mark McDonald after the affair was revealed?
He did not see his friends.
What's that?
He didn't see his friends.
And what, if any, observations did you make of Michael Ricci and his cell phone?
He got a new number eventually.
Do you know the circumstances of him getting a new number?
Because of the affair.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained. The last
Strike.
answer stricken.
And were you aware whether or not Michael Ricci, when you first moved into the house, was on social media?
Yes.
And would you see him posting things?
Not much.
And what, if anything, did you observe as it related to his social media?
All of his social media was gone.
Did you know why?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
And did you ever observe Michael Ricci go out and socializing without Christine Ricci with him?
Not that I know of.
And with regard to the incident that you previously described, where the defendant told you she punched or hit Michael in the face, do you recall seeing an injury to her body?
Yes.
Other than that injury to her hand, I believe you described, did you ever see any other injuries on her person following arguments with Michael?
Yes.
What other injuries did you say?
I had seen cuts on her.
And what about Michael following arguments?
No.
Other than bruised face?
Yeah.
And drawing your attention to May 10th of 2020, do you recall that day?
Yes.
Do you recall what that day was?
Yes.
And what day was that?
It was Mother's Day.
And just getting back a moment to the cuts you saw on Christine Ricci,
Your Honor, note my objection to that last answer based on what we talked about before.
I note your objection.
were those cuts on her hands?
No.
Were those cuts, do you know how the cuts came about?
She did it herself.
I'll let the answer stand.
She did it herself?
Yes.
Drawing your attention to Mother's Day, May 10th, 2020. I'm sorry, May 10th, 2020. You just, I believe, testified that that was Mother's Day. Is that right?
Yes.
And where were you that day?
I was at my sister's house,
Where was that?
Pembroke.
And were you with any of the Ricci family at your sister's house?
Angel.
And what were you doing at your sister's house
It was my nephew's birthday.
on Mother's Day?
Yes.
Is that traditionally Mother's Day a tough day for you?
Yes.
And could you explain why?
My mother passed away in
Objection, Your
2013.
All right. I'll strike the last answer. It's a tough day for her.
And what, if anything, were you doing at your sister's house with Angel? Was there food, drinking? What was going on?
There was food and drinking.
Did you do both?
Yes.
And at some point, did you and Angel leave your sister's house?
Yes.
And where did you go?
To our house in Marshfield.
And that's the Moraine Street address?
Yes.
And when you got there, who was there?
Christine and Michael. I'm
Would
sure
now be a good time for the short instruction?
Yes.
Jurors, I'm going to give you an instruction again with regard to prior bad acts. You are about to hear testimony about certain acts allegedly committed by the defendant. As you know, the defendant is not charged with committing any crimes other than the charges contained in the two indictments. You may not take the defendant's prior acts as a substitute for proof that the defendant committed the crimes charged, nor may you consider them as proof that the defendant has a criminal personality or bad character. But you may consider the acts solely on the limited issues of motive, state of mind, intent, plan, or absence of mistake or accident on the part of the defendant. You may not consider this evidence for any other purpose. Specifically, you may not use it to conclude that if the defendant committed these acts, she must have also committed the offense for which she has been charged. It would be extremely unfair to consider this evidence for those purposes, particularly knowing that she's not been charged with anything else related to those acts. Moreover, those acts have no relevance whatever to the charges in this case. You may proceed.
Thank you. Upon your return with Angel to the house on Moraine Street, where did you go?
In the basement.
And were you with Angel the whole time when you got back, or did you separate when you first got back?
I'm not sure.
At some point, you indicated you went down to the basement. Is that right?
Yes.
And what was in the basement?
I was packing a bag.
To go where?
To my dad's.
And could you describe what happened upon your return to the home?
There was some sort of argument. I'm not sure who it was between, so I wanted to leave.
Is that why you went and packed?
Yes.
Okay. And when you say there was an argument, where was the argument?
Upstairs in the living room.
May I have one moment, please?
Yes.
May I approach the witness?
You may.
Thank you. Ma'am, when you described, actually, let me show you this. Showing you what was marked as Exhibit 7. Do you recognize that area of the home?
Yes.
What do you recognize that to be?
The living room, dining room.
And is this the living room that you're referring to that the argument was happening in?
Yes.
I'm just going to show it to you on the large screen. It's Exhibit 7. So if you can tell us, what room are we looking at here?
Dining room.
And just for the record, I'm pointing to the lower left-hand corner of the photograph. And is it fair to say it goes right into the living room?
Yes.
And the only kind of delineation is by the material on the floor?
Yes.
And the furniture, obviously. And where in relationship to this photograph did you see and hear the argument when you emerged from the basement?
I'm not sure.
Did you know it was the living room?
Yes.
Okay. So is it fair to say in this photograph, it was in the kind of center of the photograph?
Or more in front of the bathroom, kind of just standing around the coffee table.
Could I ask for the witness to show us on the actual screen what area she's referring to, please?
She may.
So where's the bathroom?
Right here.
So you're pointing with the pointer to kind of the to the right of the brown box?
Yes.
Okay. And best of your recollection is that that's where, in that general area, the argument was happening?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And just to go back one moment, I'm going to just show you Exhibit 8. Earlier in your testimony, you were describing how the kitchen has steps down to an area, correct?
Yes.
Is that shown in this photograph, Exhibit 8?
Yes.
And those, I'm pointing to the stairs in the middle, are those the stairs that you're referring to?
Yes.
And that goes, that area goes into this area, is that correct?
Yes.
All right, I'm showing you Exhibit 6. Okay, thank you. You could resume the stand. Now, with regard to Mother's Day, May 10th, 2020, Can you explain when you got home, what door you came in through?
The side door.
And the side door was the one that you showed us, and the other red door without the wreath on it, is that right?
Yes.
And when you walked in, did you see the defendant and Michael Ricci?
Yes.
And what did you hear? Was there arguing going on?
I'm not sure if it was between the two of them.
Okay. Did you hear Christine speaking?
Yes.
And what was the tone of her voice?
Upset.
Did you hear anyone else speaking?
Angel.
What was the tone of his voice?
Upset.
What about Michael Ricci?
I'm not sure.
You have no clear memory of if he was speaking at all? Okay. And at some point, you made a decision to go downstairs to your and Angel's bedroom, is that right?
Yes.
And you indicated earlier you were packing a bag, correct?
Yes.
And then at some point, did you come back upstairs?
Yes.
Could you describe what you saw?
Christine was sitting on the kitchen floor with a knife.
And who, if anyone, was around her?
Michael and Angel.
And when you say Michael, is that Michael Sr.?
Yes.
Was Michael Jr. there?
No.
And what, if anything, were Michael Sr. and Angel doing as Christine was on the floor holding a knife?
They were trying to stop her.
And when you say trying to stop her without making any conclusory statements, trying to stop her from doing what?
Cut herself.
And at some point, were they successful in removing the knife from Christine's hand?
I'm not sure.
Okay. What did you do as this was happening?
I left.
Who'd you leave with?
My dad.
Your dad was not there, correct?
Correct.
So you left to go to your dad's?
He picked me up.
Okay. Had you seen where Christine Ricci had bought that knife from?
No.
At the time that you left the home, what was going on in the home on that day?
I'm not sure.
Well, had things calmed down, or were they still kind of in the state that you just described where they were trying to actively get the knife away?
That was happening as soon as I had walked out, so I'm not sure what happened after.
Okay. So basically, generally the same time she was holding the knife, they were trying to get it away and you were leaving?
Yes.
Okay. And at some point, did you change your living situation after or sometime in 2020?
Yes.
And what month was that?
December.
And why did you move out?
I had ended the relationship with Angel and also because of all of the fighting.
Did you remain in contact with Christine Ricci?
No.
Did you remain in contact with any of the Ricci family after you moved out?
Yes.
Who?
Angel, Sophia, and little Michael.
And after you moved out, did you ever go back into the home?
Yes.
And what was that for?
To get the rest of my things.
And did you see Christine Ricci after you moved out in December 2020?
No.
And at some point, did you come to learn about the incident on January 28th, a month later?
Objection, Your Honor.
I'll see you at the side of the bench.
And ma'am, when you lived with the Ricci's for, how long did you live with them again?
About 4 years.
4 years. And is it fair to say that kind of the halfway point in those 4 years was when you learned about the affair, correct?
Yes.
Can you describe what your relationship was like with Christine before that all happened? The
Very
first
good.
2 years?
We were very close.
Could you describe how close, like what kinds of things you guys did?
We would watch movies together, just sit on the couch, go out sometimes, go shopping.
And what about after you learned of the affair?
We still spent a lot of time together.
Can I have one moment, please?
Yes.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions, ma'am. As just getting back to Michael Ricci's social media, did you you indicated at some point it all kind of disappeared? Is that right?
Yes.
And then sometime thereafter, did you see his name pop up again and kind of a new social media account came up?
Yes.
Objection, Your Honor.
that the foundation for how she knows this?
Can you describe how you knew this information that you just described?
I believe it was a shared Facebook account.
With who?
Him and Christine.
And prior to when he had his old social media, was that a shared account, if you know?
No.
Thank you.
Cross exam.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Having lived at the Ricci home at 679 Moraine Street for 4 years, you're fairly well familiar with the layout of the house, and you talked a lot about it on direct examination.
Yes.
I want to talk about that living room, dining room area along the side of the house. As you stated, there's a transition between that room and the kitchen, and there's 2 stairs.
Yes.
And is that about a foot, would you say, or a little bit more than a foot between the sunken living room, dining room, and that kitchen?
Yes.
How tall was Michael?
6'2",
Okay. And Christine?
5'2".
Okay. In 2007, did you become, I'm sorry, 2017, when you began to live at the Ricci home, did you learn during that year that Ms. Ricci had some sort of condition that required her to wear a brace on one arm?
Yes.
Okay, you were aware of that?
Yes.
And did she wear such a brace, like, basically through most of the time that you lived with her?
Yes, but she didn't always have them on.
Okay, but that was something for an ongoing condition that you had?
Yes.
That event where you mentioned in end of 2018 where you said they had an argument, came back in, Christine had an injured hand, correct? And Michael had, you said, some swelling near his eye?
Yes.
The result of that, the injury that you saw was some swelling by his eye, correct?
It was a bruise.
A bruise. Had it already formed a bruise by the time you saw it, or only later?
Probably later. 'Cause
Okay.
It happened late at night, so I didn't see either of them until the next day.
Till the next day, okay. But Christine was fairly well hurt by that interaction, right?
Yes.
She went to the hospital?
Yes.
And she had like a cast on after that for weeks.
Yes.
That took place, as you say, at the end of 2018, so that would have been like 2.5, 3 months after the affair?
Yes.
You said a couple months after the affair, Michael started going to AA.
Yes.
He went multiple times a week.
Yes.
He got a sponsor.
Yes.
He worked the steps, correct?
Yes.
He went to a men's group.
I believe so.
He also did commitments, which is when people speak at other events, right?
Yes.
Right. He stayed sober.
Yes.
He also started to go see a mental health counselor.
Yes.
He went to see a psychiatrist as part of that.
Yes.
And he was prescribed some medications.
Yes.
And as far as you know,
Is that the basis?
May we be heard at sidebar?
Yes.
you mentioned that Michael claimed to have some memory problems in the aftermath of the affair, correct?
Yes.
Didn't he claim that in 2018 that he were long periods of time that he didn't have memory about?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Are you aware that they went for a neurological scan?
No.
Okay. Now, at this time, you were working full-time, correct?
Yes.
You were also living in the basement, right?
Yes.
As you mentioned before, there was a lot of fighting going on, right?
Yes.
You were probably trying to spend as much time as possible outside the house. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
So there could have been things like, for example, a neurological scan or other things that you might not have known about. Is that fair?
Yes.
Now, Michael's schedule, you said during direct examination, was that when he worked for the fire department, he'd work one day, correct? And then he'd have 2 days off.
Yes.
Then he'd work another 24-hour shift, right?
Yes.
And then he'd have 4 days off.
Yes.
So essentially, and that was every week. And if he wasn't working at MCC, that schedule, other than maybe a couple side jobs that he might have picked up, that's what he worked during the course of the week, right?
Yes.
And so he would have approximately like 5 days off every week.
Yes.
During that same period of time, meaning after the affair, Christine was doing Zumba, correct?
Yes.
And then, and as you said, she was going all over to sort of do Zumba, maybe teaching classes in various parts of town.
Yes.
And even doing cruises, correct?
Yes.
After COVID hit, most of her Zumba business moved into an online sort of format, right?
Yes.
And after Michael Jr. left the house in 2019, she was essentially doing most of her Zumba classes out of what was his old room.
Eventually, yes.
Yeah. And she'd be teaching multiple classes a day.
Yes.
And also, she began doing classes at Quincy College, didn't she?
Yes.
First part-time
Yes.
in the end of 2019, right? And then in 2020, during COVID, she started going full-time.
Yes.
So when you say that she was up in her room a lot, again, you're downstairs in the basement, right? Or on the first floor most of the time when you're in the Moraine Street house, right?
Yes.
So when you say that she's up in her room, what you mean is that she was on the second floor and you didn't really see her, right?
Yes.
But she was also taking online classes full-time in 2020, right?
Yes.
And doing those from an upstairs computer.
Yes.
And also she was running her Zumba classes from an upstairs bedroom.
Yes.
Okay. And she was essentially between the school, full-time school, doing the homework, plus the Zumba stuff. She had like more than a full plate, didn't she?
Yes.
Yeah. And this was at a time when Michael Sr. was only working, as you say, maybe 2 24-hour shifts over the period of a 7-day period.
Yes.
And also, at the time you were In 2018, you were 19 years old?
Yes.
And so was Angel?
Angel's 2 years older than me.
Oh, so he was 21?
Yes.
Okay, and Michael, little Michael, he was 18, 19 years old, right?
Yes.
And Sophia was 14?
Yes.
Right? So a lot of people in that house were adults capable of tidying up on their own, right?
Yes.
Right. A lot of those people had a lot more free time than Christine did at that time.
Yes.
You mentioned that a lot of the arguments and throughout the arguments were about the affair. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
It was also, though, about the fact that Michael was claiming that he didn't remember details about the affair, right?
Yes.
And not remembering large amounts of information about that period of time in general, right?
Yes.
And so, although it was about the affair, it was about oftentimes learning new information that hadn't come out until that particular discussion.
Yes.
It was sort of hard for Christine to get her arms around what exactly had happened because she was constantly learning new information. Is that fair?
Yes.
Now, in the aftermath of the disclosure of the affair, is that when, from your perspective, Michael stopped working with Mac at MCC?
I'm not sure how long after.
Okay. Was it sometime in that area of end of 2018?
Maybe soon after.
Okay, like a month or two? That's your recollection?
I'm not sure.
Okay. But it certainly wasn't like 6 or 7 months. It was a fairly short order after the events?
Yes.
Now, you left the house in December of 2020, is that right?
Yes.
You broke up with Angel in December of 2020.
Yes.
When you left the house in December of 2020, you still had a lot of your stuff at that home, right?
Yes.
And that stuff ended up getting moved into the living room, dining room area up on that first floor.
No.
Did you have a stuffed moose? Was that one of the things you had?
Yes.
Okay.
No worries. Five, six, maybe in there. No. 5, 6, 7, 8.
Well, in any event, the stuffed moose that you had, wasn't that up in that room up on the living room, dining room area?
Yes, it was downstairs for some time, but we moved it upstairs.
But after you moved out, it was brought upstairs, wasn't it?
Yes.
And there was also some of your boxes that you ended up retrieving after you went back to get your stuff that were up in that living room, dining room area, right?
Yes.
And also, Michael Jr. had moved out in June of 2019, and a lot of his stuff had gotten moved downstairs also, right?
Yes.
When she made his room into a Zumba room.
Yes.
Now, one of the things that you had mentioned that were in the photographs of the kitchen, there was a lot of projects that were sort of half done in the kitchen. Is that fair to say?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure? Okay. Was the kitchen area, because Michael was working that sort of 24 hours on, 2 days off, 24 hours on, 4 days off schedule, it was pretty common for him to do the cooking, wasn't it, during that period of time?
Yes.
And in fact, the cooking knives were actually considered by the family sort of Michael's knives, weren't they?
Yes.
And a lot of the way that the kitchen was organized, that was all by what Michael thought was the way to organize it, right? He was in charge of that.
Yes.
The event that took place in May of 2020, it was your understanding that that was an attempt that Christine made to hurt herself, right?
Yes.
Nothing further.
Any redirect or it's 1 o'clock now, so should we take a break or should we do the redirect? Over or under 5 minutes?
I think under.
Let's keep on going.
Okay.
Ms. Freeman, defense counsel asked you about the incident in which the defendant told you she hit Michael Ricci in the face with her hand, thereby injuring her hand, correct?
Yes.
And that he further asked you if she went to the hospital for that injury, correct?
Yes.
As far as you knew, based on her statements, the injury was not from Michael. She created the injury to herself by hitting him in his face, correct?
Yes.
Defense counsel was asking you about medications of people in the home. Were you aware of whether or not Christine was on many medications?
Yes.
Did you make any personal observations, Ms. Freeman, during your 4 years of living in the Ricci household of any memory issues with Michael Ricci?
No. Only after the affair.
And in regards to after the affair, what specifically were his memory issues relating to?
The
She
affair.
knows.
If she knows, she can answer.
The affair.
And specifically, do you recall the defendant asking him specifics that he couldn't remember answers to?
Yes.
Based on your observations of when you were living in the Ricci household for 4 years, did you ever, and let me ask you, were you ever a bartender?
No.
Did you ever drink alcohol at the time you were living there?
Yes.
Did you ever observe people to be alcoholics
No.
in your lifetime?
Yes.
What, if any, observations of any alcoholics did you observe in the Ricci household?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained as to that question.
Did you ever observe Michael Ricci to abuse or overdrink
Objection,
alcohol?
Your Honor.
She can answer to her own observations. Limited to your own observations.
No.
You indicated defense counsel was asking you about when you answered on direct that the defendant, after the affair, slowly started leaving her room less and less. Do you remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
And then defense counsel asked you, well, it was because she was teaching Zumba in her room. You remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
Was that, in fact, your understanding that she was locked in her bedroom teaching Zumba?
Objection, Your Honor.
Or
Rephrase that question.
what was your understanding about why the defendant was not leaving her bedroom?
There was a few reasons. One being because
Objection, Your Honor.
We've gone over this before. Move on.
I will. The defendant, just last question about this. The defendant was not teaching Zumba in her bedroom, correct?
not in her bedroom.
And defense counsel was asking you about the stuffed moose line of questioning. You remember that?
Yes.
And he further asked you, upon moving out, he asked if you had moved all your stuff up to kind of the main living area. And what was your answer?
So I hadn't moved my stuff from downstairs to upstairs. Those boxes were from when I had moved out of my house officially. And those boxes were left in the living room.
And are you referring to showing you Exhibit 7? Is that one of the boxes?
No, it was everything behind the couch towards the doors in the back.
Back here?
Yes.
Okay. Showing you what was marked as Exhibit 43. Is that all your stuff?
No.
And defense counsel lastly asked you about Michael's knives, that the kitchen knives were Michael's. You remember that line of questioning?
Yes.
The knife that you saw Christine Ricci holding the day that she was trying to hurt herself, May of 2020, was that one of Michael's knives, if you know?
I'm not sure.
Thank you.
A recross.
That exhibit number 43 that she just showed you, that was the kitchen, correct?
Yes.
Michael's domain, right?
Yes.
Nothing further.
The witness may step down.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
In a loud, clear voice, could you please introduce yourself to the jury and spell your first and last name?
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Lee Rivera. I am the investigator from the Department of Children and Families, LEIGHRIVERA,
And your date of birth?
4/12/81.
And where are you currently employed? I know you just stated it, but if you could just...
Department of Children and Families, Plymouth, Mass.
And how long have you been employed by the department?
11 years.
What did you do before you were employed there?
I was a teacher.
And as it relates to your current title at the Department of Children and Families right now, what is your title?
Response worker.
What does that mean?
So we receive 51As, and then we go out and investigate the 51As to determine the safety of children around the vulnerabilities in the home.
Could you explain what a 51A is?
The 51A is a report of child abuse or neglect.
Your Honor,
Yes?
I would object. I'd be heard sidebar briefly.
Yes, you may.
Ms. Rivera, so you became involved because a 51A was filed.
Correct.
I'm sorry, you were explaining what your roles were in the capacity, in your responsibilities at the Department of Children and Family. Let me move on. Are you familiar with the Ricci family?
Yes.
And when did you you yourself become involved with the family?
June of 2019.
And what prompted your involvement?
Michael Jr. had gone to the hospital, which resulted in a 51A being filed with the department.
And had you ever met any of the Ricci family prior to that date in June?
I did not.
And if you know, was a 51A filed by the hospital staff, and that's how you became involved?
Correct.
And once the 51A was filed, what is your role at that point?
To review the report that was filed and to make contact with the family to schedule a home visit.
And is that deemed part of your investigation?
Correct.
And did you do that in this situation?
I did.
And at some point during the course of this investigation, what if at some point did you meet and speak with the defendant, Christine Ricci?
I did.
And what, if anything, did the defendant say was had happened on June 6, 2019?
So she had...
Objection, Your Honor. Based on what we talked about before.
I'll see you at the side of the bench.
Ms. Rivera, what, if anything, did the defendant, Christine Ricci, say had happened on June 6, 2019?
So she had informed me that she was dwelling on the past, that her husband had had an affair the summer before when he had been drinking excessively, and she went into somewhat of a fit of a rage. She was having trouble getting over it, and that's what they were arguing about.
And did she specifically use the term she was in a fit of rage?
Correct.
And what did she claim she grabbed in her fit of rage?
She grabbed a mirror in her bedroom and smashed it.
And did she indicate anything further as to any statements she said as to anything thereafter?
I'm not sure what you're asking. I'm sorry.
Did she indicate after she was in a fit of rage and grabbed a mirror in the bedroom, smashing it on the floor, did she indicate that she made any statements aloud to any family members present about being better off alive or dead?
She made a comment that she'd be better off dead.
And at some point, as part of your investigation, did you question the defendant about any kind of physical abuse she suffers in her home at anyone's hands?
Yes.
And what did she state?
She denied any abuse whatsoever in the home. Actually made a comment that she and Michael were doing well and that they were in therapy trying to work through it.
And at that point, do you close the investigation?
The investigation was unsupported allegations, correct?
And specifically, that was for neglect and abuse?
Yes.
Nothing further.
No
Cross-exam-
cross. No
cross-exam. The witness may step down. Thank you. Commonwealth may call its next witness.
Commonwealth would call Robert Higgins.
Stop right there, sir. Raise your flag. Raise your right hand.
Stephanie, you solemnly swear that the testimony you given is the court and the jury and are now free to Commonwealth and defend the cross, truth, and none but the truth of God. Thank you.
You may proceed.
Yeah. Good afternoon, sir.
Hi.
Could you please tell the jurors your first and last name?
Robert Higgins,
And how old are you?
56.
If you could just speak up so that everyone can hear you into that microphone.
56.
Thank you. What city or town do you live in?
Marshfield, Massachusetts.
How long have you lived there?
30 years.
Do you work?
I do.
What do you do for work?
Self-employed. I'm a carpenter.
Okay. And do you volunteer?
I do.
What do you do for volunteer work?
I am a recovery coach for social peer recovery on a volunteer basis. Certified. Sure. I'm a certified recovery coach at Social Peer Recovery in Situate, a nonprofit.
How long have you been a recovery coach?
3.5 years. 4.5 years. I'm sorry. 4.5 years.
Do you know Christine Ricci?
I do.
When was the first time you met Christine Ricci?
Approximately August of 2019.
And how did you meet her?
We met at a softball game.
And was the softball game something sponsored by the group that you work for?
It was.
And was she by herself when you met her or with somebody
The
else?
first time I met her, she was by herself.
And when you met her at this event in 2019, did you talk to her?
Yeah.
And did she explain to you why she was at the event?
Yes. A little bit.
Why was she there?
She was getting into the recovery community to support her husband, and she wanted to have fun and play ball.
And on that particular occasion, that first meeting with her, did you meet her husband?
On the first occasion?
Yes.
I did not.
Was he there at all that day at the event or the game?
No.
At some point, did you meet her husband?
I did.
And who was her husband?
Michael Ricci.
And when did you meet Michael?
The following week.
And what was the circumstances in which you
Same
met?
circumstances at a ball game. Christine and Mike came together.
And was that another game that was sponsored by the South Shore Peer Recovery?
Yes.
Okay. And after you then met Michael, did you begin to hang around with Michael?
I did.
And how about Christine, the defendant? Did you hang out with her as well?
I did.
And can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with the two of them?
Sure.
What were you friendly with both of the individuals?
Yes, both.
As a couple and individually?
Yes.
And when you would spend time with both of them, would you be by yourself with them or with a small group of people?
It varied at different times.
And when you were with a small group of people, did you all know the people in common?
Yeah. Yes, we did.
And were they all part of that sober community that is associated with the South Shore Peer Recovery?
Yes.
When you would spend time together as this sober group, what kinds of things would you guys do?
We would go bowling. We would go out to AA meetings and sponsored events and gatherings at Christine and Michael's house. And we would go, I'd take Mike out on my boat.
Now, as far as the gatherings at the Ricci household, how often would you gather at their household?
I personally hung out there a lot. But
And so
as a group, it was a gathering place for a lot of us. But I spent the most time there. I was there a lot.
did you get to know the rest of the Ricci household?
I did.
Now, as far as your separate relationships with Michael and the defendant, first, your relationship with Michael, you mentioned that you'd take him out on your boat.
Yes.
What would you guys do out on the boat?
Go fishing.
Would it just be the two of you, or were there other people present?
Just the two of us.
And would you guys spend a lot of time talking together?
Talking, laughing.
Did you find that you had a lot in common with him, or you could share experiences with him?
Yes, we got close really quick, Christine and I, and Michael and I.
Now, this all started, you said, in the summer of 2019,
Correct.
your relationships with them?
Yes.
And kind of moving forward to the winter of 2020 and early 2021, did you notice any changes in Michael's behavior?
Yes.
Did you see him as often as you had seen him before?
In early 2020?
Well, I'll direct you to the winter of 2020 and the early of 2021, right before his death.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, there was a decline in Michael's participation in the recovery community and in our personal relationship.
And so when you say decline, had you not seen him as frequently as you had before?
That's correct.
And were you concerned by that?
Very.
And so as a result of noticing that he was not participating, what did you do?
I was calling him. I was texting him. And I went over to the house actually when I hadn't heard from him, and I knocked on the door.
And how, in relation to his passing, what was that time frame that you went to the door?
2 weeks.
Was he home when you went to the house?
He was.
And did you have the occasion to see him and speak with him?
I did.
What were your observations of his physical appearance at that time?
He looked tired. He looked gaunt. He looked like he hadn't slept. His complexion was, he looked like a defeated man.
Objection, Your Honor.
All right, I'll strike the he looked like a defeated man. He looked tired and gaunt.
Correct.
And so were your observations of him on this particular occasion different from how you had seen him previously? His physical
Yes, he
appearance?
didn't invite me into the house, and I could see that the house was dark and in dismay.
And did you have a brief conversation with him at that point?
Yeah, I did.
And then you left him.
I told him that I loved him and that if he wanted to come to my home and stay for a while, he could.
Now, was that the last time you saw Michael?
It was.
As far as your relationship with Christine Ricci, did you have a different type of relationship with her than you did with Michael?
Yes.
How would you qualify it? Is still a friendship?
Yes.
Would you spend a lot of time talking with her?
Yes.
What kinds of things would you do when you were alone with the defendant?
She was very inquisitive into the recovery aspect of what was going on, as far as she wanted to know how Mike was addressing his sobriety and also the marital issues. And
so if I may stop you for a second, these are conversations you would have with
directly with Christine, and I would talk about her feelings and what she was going through.
And as far as the questions that you said she would ask you about the recovery process, do you have some familiarity with the AA community and the process of AA?
I do.
And did you feel you had information about AA that you could share with her?
Absolutely.
So were you able to answer her questions about the procedure, like the protocols?
I was, because the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. So yes, I shared with Christine.
And as far as also talking about, you mentioned the affair. So did you have conversations with the defendant about the affair that Michael had with another woman at some point before you met them?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Did you have conversations with the defendant about the affair that Michael had with another woman prior to you meeting them?
Yes.
And how often did you talk with her about that?
Multiple times we talked about that.
And you said she would share her feelings about what happened.
Yes.
In relation to these multiple conversations with her, did you ever share your thoughts of the whole situation with her?
I did. I had empathy, and I identified with where she was at.
And during those conversations that you would have with just the defendant, were there any times where you maybe disagreed with her position?
Sure.
And what was her reaction when you weren't as empathetic or you disagreed?
She didn't like it. She wasn't happy about it.
As far as the things you would do with Christine, so you described you would fish with Michael, right?
Yeah.
What would you go do with Christine?
Christine and I had no driver's license at the time. And she would pick me up and take me to meetings and pick me up and take me to lunch, and we'd go shopping together. And we spent a lot of time together.
And as far as shopping, did you share that interest of kind of going to shopping places or going out shopping?
Sure. If I wasn't doing anything, sure, I'd go with her.
Do you recall a particular time shopping with her and going to a Home Goods in 2020?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Christine called me and asked me, "You want to go shopping?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And we went to Home Goods, and I said, "What are we shopping for?" And she said, "Mirrors." I said, "Okay, mirrors."
Can I see you both at the side of the bench?
Mr. Higgins, did you have the occasion to observe the Riccies as a couple?
Yes,
And did you often see them together at events or when you were hanging out with them?
I did.
And were you able to make observations of how they interacted in their relationship?
Yes.
As far as going to particular events, did you often see the defendant at meetings with Michael?
Every time, yes.
Every time? Mm-hmm. And in your experience in working the steps of AA and working with the sober community, is it common or is it part of the normal protocol for a spouse or a supporter to come to every meeting with the person that's engaged in the program?
It is advised that marital couples do support their spouse, but to the extent that Christine did, it was a little much. And
are there separate groups for spouses or supporters of people going through the process?
Yes, Christine and I actually attended some Al-Anon meetings together.
Now, on occasion, you said that you took Michael out on your boat and you would fish?
Correct.
Did you have the occasion to observe an interaction between Michael and the defendant while you guys were out fishing?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Mike would come fishing with me on my boat, but at 12 o'clock, he had to be back to port so that he could go on a conference call or video call with his counselor or psychologist. I'm not sure what it was. And then, so I'd have lunch on the boat, and after the appointment with his counselor, he would come back out on the boat.
And when he came back on the boat, did he have his phone with him?
Yes.
And did you have the occasion to observe a conversation he was having with his wife?
You're
yes.
on with first sidebar?
Yes.
So, Mr. Higgins, as far as when Michael came back to the boat, you indicated that you were able to overhear that he was having a conversation with his wife.
Correct.
And that the conversation was about that therapy appointment that just had occurred.
Correct.
That he left the boat to go take the call for. Yes. Is that fair to say?
Correct.
And as far as what you could overhear, what you observed in that conversation, did the defendant seem upset?
Michael was upset, yes.
I'm sorry, I'm asking about Christine. Did she seem upset?
Oh, Christine was upset too, yes.
And could you hear her asking questions about the appointment itself?
I could hear her coming through the phone, yeah, asking what the appointment was about and what he said, what he told his psychologist or counselor.
And did you observe any changes in Michael's demeanor while he was on that phone call with her?
Yeah.
And while you could hear her on the phone, could you observe any changes in the tone of her voice?
No.
Okay. Did she ask the question once or multiple times?
Multiple. She wanted to know what was going on.
There's no further question before you. Thank you, sir. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Cross exam.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
You mentioned on your direct examination that the only thing that's necessary in order for someone to be accepted into AA is
The only requirement, yes.
the only requirement is that someone sincerely want to stop drinking.
Has the desire, correct.
Correct. And it's true, isn't it, that the first realization that helps you start AA is the idea that you are powerless over alcohol.
Correct.
Right? And that your life has become unmanageable as a result of alcohol.
Correct.
And that is a personal decision and a personal realization that the individual alcoholic comes to.
That's right.
No other person can say whether another person is or is not an alcoholic.
They can say it, but it doesn't make it so. Correct.
Correct.
You're correct.
And it's true that the definition used by AA doesn't say 4 drinks a day or 5 drinks a day. It's this very searching personal determination, correct?
That is correct.
And you can be an alcoholic, for example, even if you drink whiskey, if you drink wine, or even if you just drink beer, right?
It's not what you drink or how much you drink, it's what happens to you when you do drink that determines.
Correct. And that's something that the individual alcoholic, through the process of AA, is encouraged to make realizations about themselves. And then that's the first step to making changes, right?
That's correct.
There are some people who never enter recovery until their alcoholism has reached such a degree that they're in a really desperate position, right?
Right.
There are some people that never enter recovery.
Correct.
And there are people that get off or seek help way before it progresses to that level of desperation.
Correct.
And that's why not all alcoholics look the same.
That's correct.
So it wouldn't be enough to just simply point at like, oh, you were never passed out during a period of time when you were drunk, or you weren't a mean drunk, as a way of determining whether an individual is or is not an alcoholic.
Correct.
Now, the process, once you have declared yourself to be an alcoholic, of starting the recovery process with AA involves coming to meetings, correct?
Correct.
And getting a sponsor.
Correct.
Which is an older person who's had some history in the recovery program.
Correct.
And can offer their perspective.
And guidance.
And guidance. And is there a certain amount of time that a person has to be in recovery in order to qualify as a sponsor?
No.
Okay. And the steps that we talk about that occur in AA involve, among many other steps, 12 total steps. One of the steps is the process of making amends. Would you agree with me?
In step 1?
No. During the process of working through the
Eventually,
steps.
yes, that's step 9.
That's step 9.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I want to talk about the amends step just for a moment.
Okay.
That involves someone who is in the recovery process who goes to someone that he feels that he wronged, or he or she wronged, during the time that he was drinking, correct?
Step 9 is made a direct amend to people we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all.
And that usually involves a face-to-face sit-down with the person that you wronged.
It can, yes.
Okay. And obviously, this is a fairly emotionally awkward, or it can be a socially awkward moment for someone the first time they do it. Isn't that fair?
Can be.
Oftentimes, people write out their amends before they give the amends. Isn't that right?
Yeah, could be.
And one of the points of the amends step is for the alcoholic to confront the shame that he has about things that he did when he was drinking, which can be a driver, can it, to somebody maybe returning and getting off the path.
Could you elaborate, please, for me?
Yeah, well, let's put it this way. When a person gives amends to someone, they're doing it, yes, to say sorry to the person they've wronged, but they're also doing it for themselves, aren't they? As part of their recovery.
It's not sorry. And each individual has their own way of addressing their amends with the person that they're making the amends with. So I can't speak on that.
What happens if during the process of giving amends, the person they're talking to says, you don't need to apologize to me? Could it still be important for the alcoholic to finish making that amend, even though the person says, I don't need an apology?
Usually the individuals that are making amends have already been through step 5, and we do that in step 5.
Okay.
That's where we find our forgiveness.
Right.
So what the individual does with the amends that we're trying to make in step 9 is on them.
Right.
We're already free. We found our freedom already.
So the saying of amends doesn't depend on the person that you're talking to or the person you're making amends to needing an apology.
Well, an amends is becoming willing to do whatever it takes to make amends to that person. It's action.
And it's the willingness in the individual to do it.
And the action, yes.
And the action.
Correct.
And even if the person says, hey, I don't need an apology, it can still be important for the alcoholic to do that step 9 and make the full amends, list out to the person what he feels that he did that was wrong, and make a direct statement in that way.
That's an individual basis.
Yeah. But it could be that way, right? That's possible.
Could be, sure, yeah.
You would agree with me that making amends can be difficult to do for some individuals?
Sure.
Particularly if the person isn't used to speaking about their emotions?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the term dry drunk?
Yes.
Could you explain that?
Dry drunk typically is someone who had a drinking problem, put down the drink, and then didn't enter the recovery community.
Even if they entered the recovery community and started essentially being sober and going to meetings, they can still be a dry drunk, right?
It's possible, sure, they are out there.
The idea is that you can be clear of alcohol, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily recovered.
If the individual had underlying issues.
Yeah. Your behavior, which led you to drink, may still be in existence even after you stop drinking.
Could be.
And even particularly in the early stages of recovery, right? The first year and a half, that's when a lot of the emotions that were covered by the alcohol sort of start to come out, right?
Could.
Isn't that fairly typical?
Typical? I can't speak on that.
Okay. Well, frustration, anger, these are typical emotions that do occur in the early days of the recovery process that need to get dealt with as part of the AA program.
It can. It can be that way for some.
Now, Al-Anon is a program for people who have members of their family who are suffering from alcoholism, right?
To support group, correct.
Yeah. And it helps the person in the alcoholic's family recover, but it also gives tips as to how that person can support the alcoholic, right?
Correct.
In addition to all the other things that you mentioned a moment ago, you said that, did you know that Michael had a sponsor in AA?
Yes.
And are you aware that he would also do commitments, speaking commitments?
Yes.
And are you aware that he went to a men's group?
Yes.
Okay. And of course, a commitment is a speech that you give to other AA groups about your own process of recovery, right?
Speech, no.
It's not a speech?
It's not a speech.
Okay. How would you describe it?
It's a heartfelt description of one's own experience with alcohol, and then the solution that came about in order to recover from that alcoholism.
And you do that verbally,
to
right?
promote hope and to show that there's a way out of your problems, yes.
And that's done verbally in front of another
Verbally,
group?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
sober houses, other groups, recovery communities, halfway houses, institutions. We go to institutions as well. We go to jails. Yeah.
Now, it's not unusual for people who, during the process of recovery, start to change the group of people that they were hanging around with when they were still living their actively drinking life. That's not unusual, is it?
It's not unusual. It happens. It happens.
Well, let me do it this way. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to confuse you with the question, but let me break it down.
Thank you.
For example, a lot of times, the social life of the alcoholic will largely revolve around alcohol prior to getting sober, right?
Correct.
And their friends that they had in that world that revolved around drinking would often be people who shared those habits with them. They're not saying they had problems, but they would be people who knew them as drinking people.
Right. Correct.
And it's not unusual for people when they enter into sobriety and recovery to start changing their social environment.
Correct. Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
And starting to do different activities.
Yes.
That's why you do sober softball.
Sure.
And that's why you do the sober bowling, right?
Yes.
And also sometimes it may be necessary to get a group of friends who are on the same path as you.
Absolutely. Like-minded individuals. Yes.
Right. And oftentimes the alcoholic will find it hard to go back to the group of friends that they had before when they were drinking because of those social associations that we just talked about, right?
Yes, correct.
And that's why friends like you were so important to people like Michael and Christine. At that
Michael
time.
was important to me, yes.
Yeah. And you were important to him.
Yes, thank you.
I have nothing further.
Redirect.
Questions, please. Mr. Higgins, as far as the people who participate in the AA program, they do not have to self-identify as an alcoholic to participate in the program, do they?
No.
And as far as the 12 steps of the process, is it fair to say that the defendant, you spent a lot of time talking to the defendant about each and every one of those 12 steps?
Yes.
And she asked a lot of questions about each of those steps and how to go through those steps and work those steps.
Yes.
And when you were asked about step number 9, you mentioned that step number 9 is amends, but there's a prior step before that, step number 5, where you find forgiveness, and that's for the participant in the program, correct?
Correct.
And as far as step number 9 goes, you were asked some questions about that, but can you explain who step number 9 is focused on in the process? Is it on the participant or is it on somebody else?
Both.
Okay. And
But it's primarily for the individual the participant wants to approach.
so the person that they wronged.
It's about making amends to that individual, yes.
Okay. You were also asked on cross about the fact that some people find that there's kind of frustration and anger in those early stages of sobriety. Do you remember that line of
I
questioning?
remember that question, yes.
Is it fair to say each journey's process through sobriety and through the steps of AA are different and personal to them?
Absolutely.
And as far as your observations of Michael Ricci when he was working these steps and going through the process, did you observe him with frustration and anger in his
Oh, he
sobriety?
was willing and enthusiastic about it.
Thank you. Nothing further.
The witness may step down.
Thank you. Thank you.
May I inquire?
You may.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jury and spell your last name for the record?
Yeah, my name is Greg Davis, D-A-V-I-S. I'm a detective with the Marshfield Police Department.
How long have you been employed as a police officer, sir?
20 years. 20.
And have you always been employed by the Marshfield Police Department?
I worked part-time for Duxbury Police prior to that for 2.5 years.
And what is your current position or title?
I'm a detective.
How long have you been a detective, sir?
Approximately 12 years now.
And prior to becoming a detective, what was your position?
I was a patrolman.
And what are some of your duties and responsibilities as a detective?
We respond to general crimes. We do sexual assault investigations. We do drug investigations. We do unattended death investigations as well.
And back in 2021, were you a detective at Marshfield Police Department?
I was.
How many death investigations have you been involved in, sir?
Numerous death investigations.
Drawing your attention, sir, to January 28th, 2021, were you working that late afternoon?
I worked that day, but I was not working at the time this call came in.
What shift had you been working that day?
That day I worked the 8 to 4 shift.
And at approximately 5 p.m., were you called into work?
I was.
By whom?
Lieutenant Marcolini.
For what?
He said that there was a stabbing on Marine Street, and he said that state police were responding, and he'd like me to meet them there to assist.
And how large a department is Marshfield, sir, just to give us an idea?
Approximately 45 employees right now.
And is that unusual for you to be off work but get called in following a situation like this?
No, not at all.
And after you got that call at approximately 5 p.m., where did you go?
I went to 679 Marine Street.
And can you describe that location, sir?
Yeah, it's a single-family residence located on Marine Street, amongst other single-family residences.
Just showing what was previously marked as Exhibit 35, sir. Is this the location that you responded to?
Yes, it is.
And when you arrived, what was your role? What did you do?
At that point, I arrived. There were 3 other officers from Marshfield at the scene: Lieutenant Sullivan, Sergeant Tingley, and Officer Hunt.
And had the scene been secured at that point?
Yes, it was. I just arrived and stayed outside with those 3 officers.
Was it light or dark out when you arrived?
It was dark out.
And the weather that night?
It was a snowy night. There had been snow. It was icy.
When you arrived, were you briefed about the actual 911 call that had come in?
Yes.
And what information were you made aware of, sir?
Objection, Your Honor.
Generally, what were you there for, sir?
I was there to respond to take over and assist with the state police that were responding to the scene as well.
And were you provided information as to the identity of the people involved in the Marine Street address?
I was, yes.
And what names were provided?
Michael Ricci and Christine Ricci.
And when you arrived, sir, did you go inside the home or did you stay outside the home at that juncture?
Yeah, at that juncture, I stayed outside.
And were you made aware of where Michael Ricci was at that time?
Yes, he'd been transported to South Shore Hospital.
And where was Christine Ricci?
At that point, she was at the Marshfield Police Station.
And were you made aware of any other relatives that had been in the home that had since left the home?
Yes.
And who was that?
Sophia Ricci.
And where was she?
She was also with the Marshfield Police.
And what did you do next after you were initially briefed at the home?
I went back to the Marshfield Police Station.
And once there, sir, did you coordinate efforts with the state police at that point in the investigation?
I did, yes.
And ultimately, were you named the case officer for Marshfield Police Department?
I was, yes.
And in investigating deaths in your town, do you often collaborate with another law enforcement agency, sir?
Yes, I do.
And who is that?
That'd be the state police assigned to the district attorney's office.
And as the case officer for the Marshfield Police Department, were you in fact paired up with a state trooper in this matter to conduct follow-up investigation?
I was, yes.
Who is that, sir?
Trooper Corey Mello.
And he's no longer, he has a different position now, as far as you know, correct?
Yes,
And did you work closely with Trooper Mello in this investigation, sir?
I did, yes.
Can you tell us what a neighborhood canvass is?
A neighborhood canvass is something that detectives do usually when there's any type of a crime. They'll go door to door to neighbors' houses just to knock and talk to the residents to see if anything was seen or heard suspicious.
And at times, if there's video footage from homes, like Ring doorbells, that might be collected at that time. Is that right?
Any kind of video footage, definitely.
And similar to other situations, was a neighborhood canvass conducted in this case?
Yes, it was.
Anything notable discovered?
No.
And at some point soon after you became involved, was a search warrant obtained for the Marine Street residence?
Yes, it was.
And at some point, sir, did you come to learn that crime scene services from the state police had gone to the Marine Street residence?
Yes, I did.
And what was their purpose in them going to that location?
To gather scientific evidence and to seize any evidence at the scene.
And at some point, did you go back to the Marine Street residence?
I did, yes.
And was it that night?
Yes, it was.
And did you walk around the home and make observations?
I did.
May I approach the witness, please?
You may.
May we approach?
You may.
May I approach?
May.
Just a moment. So I'm just going to approach with what was previously marked as Exhibit 44 and ask if you recognize what that is in the photograph.
Yes, I do.
And what is in Exhibit 44 as best as you recollect, sir.
I believe that's the master bedroom.
And this is fair to say it's one side of the master bedroom, correct?
Correct.
May I approach again? I'm just going to ask you to take a look at another photograph, sir, and tell me if you recognize what that is.
I do.
And what do you recognize that to be?
Also the master bedroom.
And is that the opposing side on the other side of the bed?
Yes.
And is that a fair and accurate depiction of how it appeared that night?
Yes, it is.
For the actual search warrant execution, but after the house was secured?
Yes, as far as I'm aware, yes.
I'd ask that this be marked as an incident.
Objection?
I would renew my objection with regard to the tidiness stuff we spoke about.
I note that objection. The photo of the other side of the master bedroom will be marked in minute as Exhibit 45. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
With the court's permission, may I just publish it?
Yes.
Thank you. So just showing you what was previously marked as Exhibit 45. This is the other side of the bedroom, is that right?
Yes.
And in essence, we're looking at the same bed here, just different angles, is that right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And as part of your role as case officer, sir, are you aware that certain items were taken from 679 Marine Street into evidence?
Yes.
And specifically, what was taken as far as you know from that actual location?
Objection, Your Honor.
Basis?
We need to approach. I'm sorry. I hate to do this.
Sir, in the course of the investigation, were certain items taken from the scene that were deemed to have some evidentiary value?
Yes, they were.
And specifically, were those knives that were located on the scene?
Yes, they were.
And when crime scene services arrived, were the knives ultimately given to crime scene services to process and attempt to extract evidence from them?
Yes.
And during your observations of the living area and where the crime allegedly occurred, did you make any observations of any sign of furniture disturbed or turned upside down or anything out of order?
No, I did not.
What, if any, signs of an apparent struggle were observed?
I did not note any signs.
And what, if any, interviews were conducted of family members, namely children, that evening?
Sophia was interviewed at the Marshfield Police Station, I believe by Trooper Mello, but I'm not positive. And I know that the other two sons are also interviewed at the hospital by troopers. I believe it was Trooper McDonald.
And in terms of the sons, are you referring to Angel Ricci and Michael Ricci Jr.?
Yes, correct.
And following the interviews of Angel, the brief interviews of Angel and Michael Jr. At the hospital by Trooper McDonald, are you aware as the case officer that they consented to provide their phones?
Yes.
And at some point that evening, sir, as a case officer, did you come to learn that Michael Ricci was declared deceased?
I did, yes.
And was that information provided by a particular doctor that you know the name of?
Dr. Toyer, I believe his name was.
And at approximately what time was he declared deceased?
Approximately 5:30 p.m.
And did you come to learn of or observe the injuries that Mr. Ricci suffered from?
I did, yes.
Could you describe the injuries that you observed?
Objection, Your Honor. We have this through multiple sources already.
Sustained.
And are you aware if law enforcement officers took photographs at the hospital of Mr. Ricci?
Yes.
And was that a crime scene services trooper that took the photographs?
Yes, it was.
And what, if anything, was taken into evidence from Michael Ricci's person?
I believe it was clothing that was taken as evidence.
And did that include his the 2 shirts that had been torn off him to perform life-saving measures?
Yes.
And is it fair to say those were sent to the lab?
Correct, yes.
And in terms of Christine Ricci, were certain items taken off her person and sent to the lab?
Yes.
And what items were taken from her?
Clothing as well.
And did you have an opportunity to observe the defendant at the police station that evening?
Yes, I did.
What, if any, significant injuries did you observe on her person?
I didn't see significant injuries. I did see scratches.
And do you know if the items of her clothing were sent to the lab and subsequently tested?
Yes, they were.
And were other individuals as part of the investigation interviewed, sir?
Yes.
And was that primarily friends and family members of both Christine Ricci and Michael Ricci?
Yes, as well as co-workers.
And co-workers, thank you. And in terms of search warrants, were any search warrants done in this case, sir?
Yes, there were.
And what was that for?
It was for further evidence. I believe it was for cell phones.
And the house, obviously, as we discussed earlier, correct?
Correct.
And was any video surveillance obtained to establish any kind of timeline in this case?
Yes, there was one piece of surveillance that was taken.
And where was that taken from?
That was the Dunkin' Donuts on Ocean Street in Marshfield.
And were you able to go to Dunkin' Donuts and obtain that footage from the day in question?
Yes, I was.
And what was the purpose of obtaining that, sir?
Just to establish a timeline.
And it was put onto a disc, is that correct?
Yes, it was.
I'd ask that this be marked as the next exhibit and then shown to the jury, which we've downloaded onto the computer.
Is there any objection to that?
No, Your Honor.
It'll be marked in a minute as Exhibit 46. Thank you.
And it's a short video, a couple minutes long, Your Honor, with your permission, may replay.
May.
I'm playing it at 2:19.
And for the record, it's going to start at 2:19 p.m., 2:19 and 10 seconds in the afternoon. Were you able to identify who's shown in that upper right-hand corner close-up?
Yes.
And who is that?
Michael Ricci.
And were you able to establish that that's the vehicle that he drives or drove?
Yes.
And while this is playing, sir, which Dunkin' Donuts was this?
It was the Dunkin' Donuts located on Ocean Street in Marshfield.
Where is that in relationship to the Marine Street, 679 Marine Street?
I'd say probably within a mile and a half tops. There's 2 in Marshfield. There's another one on Plain Street, but that's much further away.
And just for the record, Mr. Ricci is pulling up to the drive-thru and obtaining his food, beginning at 2:19 and ending at approximately 2:21. Is that accurate? 2:22, sir?
Yes, correct.
One moment, please. Nothing further at this time. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. One last question. Sir, as part of your investigation, did you also obtain text messages from a Janine Bouchard?
Yes, I did.
And who were those text messages between?
Janine and Christine Ricci.
And there was a series of multiple text messages from 3 dates that you were able to successfully obtain, correct?
Yes, correct.
Nothing further.
Cross-exam.
You mentioned during direct examination that none of the furniture that you saw was disturbed.
That's correct, sir, yes.
You don't know the way that the furniture normally looks inside the 679 Marine Street house, correct?
Correct. I've never been there before this day.
And there had already been a number of police officers and first responders in the home between the time that authorities first arrived or were responding to this call and the time you got there.
Yes, that's true.
Okay. Is what you meant that just as far as you know, no furniture was disturbed or moved?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Nothing further.
Any redirect?
No, thank you.
The witness may step down.
Thank you.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, sir.
Afternoon.
In a loud, clear voice, could you please introduce yourself to the jury and spell your last name?
Yes, my name is Michael Ricci Jr. It's last name's R-I-C-C-I.
Thank you, sir. And what is your date of birth?
11/04/1999.
And how old are you?
24.
What is your current address?
100 Reedville Street in Hyde Park.
And who do you live there with?
My girlfriend.
And do you work, sir?
I do.
What do you do?
I work for a boiler company. It's called George T. Wilkinson.
George T. Wilkerson?
Wilkinson, yeah.
Wilkinson?
Wilkinson, yeah.
And you said boiler company?
Yeah.
And what do you do for them?
I'm a parts driver.
And prior to your current employment, what did you do, sir?
I was working for a firearm company called Prestige Alarm.
Did you graduate high school?
I did.
From which high school?
Marshfield High School.
Where did you grow up, sir?
In Marshfield.
Your entire life?
Since I want to say 2007.
And what specific address did you live at?
679 Marine Street.
And when you lived there, sir, who did you live there with?
My brother and sister, Angel and Sophia, and my parents,
And your parents' names?
Christine and Michael Sr.
And you obviously were named after him.
Yes.
And the ages of your siblings, sir?
I believe my brother is 27 and my sister is 18.
And do you all share the same mother?
I believe so, yes.
And do you all three share the same father?
No, me and my sister share the same father.
And your father is Michael Ricci Sr.?
Yes.
And then was Angel at some point early on adopted by your father?
Yes.
And what did he call your father? Did he call him dad?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And that was a legal adoption, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And your mother, Christine Ricci, do you see her in the courtroom today, sir?
I do.
Can you please point to her and tell me something she's wearing?
Of course, she's in the blue blazer right over there.
Thank you. May the record reflect the identification made by the witness of the defendant?
Any objection? The record will reflect that the witness has identified Christine Ricci.
And your father, sir, his full name is Michael Ricci Sr.?
Yes.
I'm just going to show you a photograph, sir, and tell me if you recognize the photograph.
Yep, I do.
Is that your dad?
That's my dad.
What did your father do for work, sir, when you were growing up?
He was a Boston fireman.
Do you know how long he was a Boston firefighter, sir?
I think about 22, 23 years.
Did you know what firehouse he was working at when he passed away?
I do. I believe it was a fire on Atherton Street in Jamaica Plain. I think it was ladder 42, I think.
And besides being a firefighter, were you aware of any other jobs your father did?
Yes.
What else did he do?
He worked for a sprinkler company.
And are you aware of your father's military background at all?
I am, yeah.
And what branch was he in?
The Army.
And are you aware of when your father stopped working at the sprinkler company?
I can't pinpoint the year for certain, but maybe around 2018, 2019, if I had to guess.
And do you know who he worked with at the sprinkler company?
I do.
Was it somebody you knew well?
I did.
Who was that?
Mark McDonald.
And who was Mark McDonald?
He was our uncle and my dad's best friend for as long as we can remember, over 40 years.
And did he play kind of a special role in your family?
Yes.
Could you describe that?
Like I said, he was our uncle and he was the closest person to us that I could think of. And like I said, he's my dad's best friend and we always saw him around my dad and it was always a great time to be around him.
Was he also asked to be Sophia's godfather?
Yes, he was.
And can you describe your relationship with your father right before he passed, sir?
Like the month before or like how?
The year leading up to his death. Did you see him?
I did see him, yes.
And could you describe your relationship?
It was distant, but it was strong. There was no ill will, no grudges towards each other. I mean, there was always an I love you anytime we try to talk on the phone or text or in person. So there's no strain between the two of us.
What was your childhood like in the Ricci household at 679 Marine Street, sir, when you were a young boy?
I thought it was a normal household. Didn't seem like I was going through hard adversities. And as a kid, I just normal go to school, get fed, have some hobbies, and spend time with the family. And I seemed pretty normal to me.
And did you guys have like family dinners together at times?
Yep. We would always watch TV shows or watch a sports game together in the living room and eat dinner together.
And who shared kind of the household responsibilities? Was it on one person or was it distributed?
It was somewhat distributed between the two parents, but I'd say maybe one took on a little bit more than the other, but it was definitely split between the two parents.
And who would you say took on more?
Maybe a little bit more my dad.
Was that always how it was, or did it become that way over time?
I think it maybe just become that way over time, just because I think it was more of the time when we were living in the house longer than 5 years, so we started getting comfortable with how the neighborhood was and how our house was, so we got more responsibility to take care of. So. And
was your family close, would you say?
I would say so, yes.
And Drawing your attention to the fall of 2018, sir, what, if any, changes did you observe in your home?
There's a lot of silence, what felt like tension, and overall concern of where people were. So,
what do you mean concern over where people were?
I noticed that my dad was not home. He was not home for longer than usually his schedule would be as a firefighter.
So it was noticeably different?
Yes.
And then did it change from a house filled with silence and tension to something different?
Yes.
Could you describe that?
It was hostile, very loud, and I guess even more tension than it was before.
Did you become aware of something your father had done?
Yes.
And was this the fall of 2018, roughly?
I believe so, yes.
And how did you become aware of what had happened?
I was with my sister upstairs. I think it was in her room, and we got called by either the defendant or my dad to come downstairs because they wanted to talk to us. And we were told that my dad is an alcoholic.
Was this a surprise to you?
Yes.
And was that the nature, basically, of that initial conversation?
Yes.
And was anything else said about your dad being an alcoholic at that time?
Yeah, there was additional information, but I was told privately about it.
Well, I'll get to that. There was a subsequent conversation with you and your father, is that right?
Yes.
Is that when you found out about an affair?
I did, yeah.
Okay. And where were you when that conversation took place, sir?
Me and my father were both in his car.
And how did that come to be?
We were driving around, I think, the parking lot of Star Market, Shaw's. And he said, there's also something I want to tell you, that I saw another woman.
And when was that conversation in relationship to the conversation about him being an alcoholic?
I believe it was the same day, maybe 30 minutes to an hour after the initial sit down that we had.
And what was his demeanor when he was talking to you in the car that day?
I could notice that it was a lot of guilt coming out of his voice.
And how long did that conversation with your father in the car or in the parking lot of Shaw's or Star Market last, sir?
It was pretty brief. It wasn't longer than maybe 50 minutes.
And then where did you and your father go thereafter?
We went immediately back to the house.
And when the two of you arrived back at the house, was there any further conversation that day that you recall occurring about the affair?
Not that I can recall, no.
Okay. And following that particular day, when you learned about both those things about your father, did you see changes in your father thereafter?
I did.
Can you describe those changes, sir?
He was a lot more quiet. Not a lot of one-on-one time between the kids and our dad. He was there, but he wasn't present, if that makes any sense.
And what, if any, changes did you see in your mother?
There was a lot of high vocals coming from her, a lot of screaming. The house felt very tense. And it was very uncomfortable.
And in terms of a lot of screaming by your mother, could you tell us a little bit more about how often you would hear her screaming?
If it wasn't every night, it was every other 2 nights. It was very often.
And what would she be screaming about?
The woman my dad had a relationship with.
And what kinds of things do you recall her screaming about in particular?
Objection, Your Honor.
I'll allow him to answer it if he remembers.
It was, do you love her? Were you going to start a family with her? And how they had sexual intercourse together.
And would you hear your father respond in any way?
Most of the time, yes, but it wasn't too loud to hear. It wasn't a high vocal.
It was not a high vocal?
No.
Okay. Did you hear him screaming as much as your mom?
Not really, no.
And after you learned of the things you just previously described about your father, I'm sorry, strike that. At some point, sir, did you make a decision to move out of your home?
I did.
When was that?
June 6th of 2019.
Your Honor, may we approach? Yes.